this week is the respiratory system. We're going to start off with probably 2 videos about the anatomy of the organs and structures of the respiratory system. So basically the reasoning for needing a respiratory system is that all body processes require ATP, which is our body's energy currency, either directly or indirectly. And to make ATP, each cell requires oxygen and produces carbon dioxide in the process of cellular respiration. So if each of our cells need all of that, then we better find a way to get it there. So since the respiratory system is the system of tubes to deliver air to the lungs, and then the oxygen diffuses into the blood and carbon dioxide diffuses out. So the respiratory and the cardiovascular systems work together, delivering the oxygen to the tissues and removing the carbon dioxide. Also, the respiratory system and the urinary system are working together to regulate the body's acid-base balance, which we will look at closer when we are in the urinary system. We'll have a whole separate video of respiration, so making sure that we are clear about the ventilation of the lungs is what we call breathing, but then also that includes the exchange of gases between the air and the blood, and the exchange between the blood and the tissue fluid, and then exactly how oxygen is used in cellular respiration. So overall functions of the respiratory system, we need to have oxygen into the tissues and carbon dioxide released, and so that is, we also have to have that exchange between the blood and the air. Not only the blood and the tissues, but between the blood and the air. The function of the respiratory system also includes speech and smell, regulating pH of our body fluids. Carbon dioxide, if it kind of builds up in the body, it will form an acid, carbonic acid, and so then that would have all of our tissues become acidic. Also regulation of blood pressure to help with the flow of lymph and venous blood. And during certain times, urination, defecation, and childbirth, the respiratory system helps to expel the contents of the abdomen. So we're going to talk about each of these parts of the respiratory system in more detail, but here's just kind of grouped into sections. So the conducting division of the respiratory system is our nostrils through the major bronchioles. So that's going to include the nose, the pharynx, the larynx, trachea, bronchi. And then the respiratory division is the bronchioles to the alveoli. So that's going to be the bronchi and the alveoli, because that is where the gas exchange is actually occurring. So in the conducting division, we're only talking about airflow, and there's no gas exchange happening. The respiratory tract is also divided up to upper and lower. Now this is kind of loosely utilized. I wouldn't rely on it too much, but from the nose to the larynx is considered the upper respiratory tract, and then from the trachea to the lungs is considered lower. So let's look at each one closer. Our nose is contained of our nostrils, and then they open up to the posterior nasal aperture. And then the exterior portion is bone and hyaline cartilage. This kind of outlines the superior portion, inferior portion, but you should remember the bones back from A&P 1. And the function of the nose is to warm, cleanse, and humidify the air as it's inhaled. It does detect odors and serves as a resonating chamber that amplifies the voice. So there's looking at the outside features of the nose, and then that's showing you where the nasal bone is, where the cartilage is, and where our dense connective tissue is. We know that our nose has left and right halves, and that's technically called the nasal fossae. The nasal septum is what divides the nasal cavity, and it has a bone. The vomer forms the inferior part, and the septal cartilage forms the anterior part of that division. And then our roof and floor of our nasal cavity are kind of outlined by bones of the skull, and the hard palate forms the floor. And then our paranasal sinuses and the nasolacrimal duct both drain into the nasal cavity. In the beginning of the nasal cavity, it's called the vestibule. It's a small dilated chamber that's just inside the nostrils. It's lined with stratified squamous epithelium, and we have these guard hairs that block larger items from entering the nose. But then after the vestibule, the nasal cavity expands into a larger chamber, but it's not really a cavernous space. It doesn't have very much open space because it has these three folds of tissue called the nasal conchae. And they are important because they basically make turbulence that makes sure that the air contacts mucous membranes. So they come out from the sides, the lateral walls of the nasal cavity, and extend toward the septum. But they basically make sure that the air, again, makes turbulence and contacts those mucous membranes. And that way, it's able to be filtered on the way in. So this cleans, warms, and moistens the air. And then also within the nose, we have olfactory epithelium to detect odors. It is covering a small area of the roof of the nasal fossae and adjacent parts of the septum and the superior conchae. This epithelium is made of ciliated, pseudostratified, columnar epithelium, all the way back to AMP1, that have goblet cells, but those cells have cilia that are moving together to help move the air. And then the cilia that are not moving binds to the molecules that detect odor, or the molecules that are making the odor. Okay, except for the vestibule, the rest of the nasal cavity is lined with respiratory epithelium, and those cilia are moving, and then the goblet cells within them secrete mucus, and the cilia propels the mucus backwards towards the pharynx, and eventually it is all swallowed into the digestive tract. Your nasal, or in the conchae, the inferior conchae, there is erectile tissue. And so every half hour to an hour, this tissue on one side swells with blood, and it restricts the airflow to that side. And then the air is directed to the other nostril, and that basically lets one side recover, and then it kind of shifts back and forth once or twice an hour. So there's the vomer that we're talking about, there's your nasal septum, and then this is showing you the three sections of the pharynx, which is what's coming next. Nasopharynx, oropharynx, and laryngopharynx. The pharynx is weird because it's a space, it's not really a structure. It's a muscular funnel. It extends 13 centimeters, but these three regions, I think, are sometimes, it's a little fuzzy, which is which region. But this is giving you kind of landmarks, but I'll just be honest, sometimes it's kind of hard to divvy it up, especially towards the bottom. So the nasopharynx is technically posterior to the nasal apertures, but above the soft palate. This receives the auditory tubes and has the pharyngeal tonsil. And it allows the air to have a 90-degree downward turn, and that downward turn traps large particles that are larger than 10 micrometers. The oropharynx is technically between the soft palate and the epiglottis, and then the laryngopharynx is the epiglottis to the cricoid cartilage. And so that the bottom of the laryngopharynx is basically the beginning of the esophagus. Okay, this talks about the types of tissue for each one. The nasopharynx is only passing air, and it's lined with still that respiratory epithelium, the pseudostratified columnar epithelium. But the oryngopharynx and the laryngopharynx have air, food, and drink, and so they are lined with stratified squamous epithelium.